right, it's 3 after. We'll go ahead and get started. I do just want to say we are going to be recording this. So if you're not comfortable with being recorded, please drop from the call now. Thanks again for everyone joining. My name is Jonathan Lawrence. I'm a cloud solution architect with Microsoft. I work with Camila and your account executives as a part of your account team to support you from a technical standpoint. Excuse me. And today we are joined by our friends from Silverfort, and they're going to be kind of walking us through, just as the description says, right, how we can protect yourself from ransomware, as well as prepare for cyber insurance checklists. So with that, thanks again for joining, and I'll kind of throw it over to Ron from Silverfort.
Thanks a lot, Jonathan. Thanks for joining. Appreciate you with us today, and we'll dive into hopefully what's an interesting chat about again what we do at Silverfort, just at a high level, and then we'll talk about how the threat landscape has evolved. Again, things that are I'm sure day to day that you see in schools and in your environments. We'll talk about how cyber insurance has adopted some of these, or how it reacted to the evolving threat and ransomware threat. Then we'll dive into how our solution actually works under the hood. I'll pass it over to Jason to explain kind of how we're architected, and then show you a live demo, which is probably the most interesting part of how we work together with Microsoft to really provide you security and combat all of these emerging threats. And we'll definitely have plenty of time for questions and answers, so you can throw. We're relatively an intimate forum, so you can feel free to throw questions in the chat. While you think of them, you don't have to wait, and then we'll pause now and then to answer them, and we'll have plenty of time at the end also to answer questions. So without further ado, and I didn't introduce myself. I'm Ron. I head up product management and our alliance with Microsoft, and with us from the Silverfort team is also Jason Schupp, who manages our sales engineers and engineering team in the US. All right, so in a jiffy, what we do. So today you have a lot of applications that work with Azure AD natively. You get all the benefits of Azure AD. You get conditional access and all the different capabilities like identity protection and granular policies, and you can leverage your device trust and everything you can do to really lock down apps and secure them in the best way possible. You get auditing on the apps, and you can do great things. Now, in some cases, there's apps that just don't work with Azure AD natively, and then you have secure hybrid access partners just using Azure AD App Proxy to bridge them into Azure AD. So we're secure hybrid access partners. We do all of that, but also there's still a lot of resources that you have in your network that aren't just web apps, right? That might be like a file share, a database, and a homegrown or legacy system that you have that's in place for a while. Maybe you have VDI or all kinds of different IT infrastructure that doesn't work natively with Azure AD. On-premise access like administration access, like remote PowerShell or PSX or SSH or WMI. All of those are interfaces to interact with your servers that don't work with Azure AD out of the box. And think of RDP access, VPN access. Not everything works as a web app in Azure AD. And what Silverfort basically does is bridges that gap. So we'll connect things from Active Directory, from ADFS, from any kind of PAM solution you have. We'll pull them into Azure AD to allow you to leverage all of the security controls you have in Azure AD for all the resources that don't work out of the box with Azure AD. And we'll dive into how it works. So just at a really, this is a very non-comprehensive review of how ransomware has evolved, but it's since WannaCry, which was a huge attack ransomware really has evolved, right? It's become something that's commoditized, basically, right? There's a low barrier of entry. There's hacker groups that just use it. It accounts for a lot of the attacks, right? Now, what's interesting when you look at, everyone always mentions is ransomware as the problem, but ransomware is only part of the problem, right? The ransomware itself, it harms a single computer. But if there's one infected machine with ransomware executed, then you lost one computer. That usually isn't a big deal. It's a local event. But when lateral movement is involved and multiple machines, computers, resources are encrypted and damaged, that's when there's a critical business impact. So what makes ransomware so harmful is the fact that it's always paired with a lateral movement campaign. Now, I want to explain that lateral movement, the way we see it, is an identity threat. It's a lot of times not looked at as an identity threat, but the way lateral movement happens is a user account is compromised by any method, right? It could be phishing or any method, or somehow sometimes the user account is brute force, but eventually the attacker has a username and password. It leverages native capabilities in Active Directory to log into a bunch of resources, and any resource that this user can log into becomes compromised, right? Because once you're logged into the resource, then you can scrape the credentials that exist on that resource, even for other users. Then you have another set of users, and then you can laterally move to all the resources that those users can access, and eventually you get a domain admin, and that's it. And all I described now in a very manual and step-by-step manner is done in an automated manner, right? There's tools that just do this, and without a single need to wait for a human command to come in. So again, lateral movement is the problem with ransomware, and a lateral movement is an identity threat. And now, some of the economic things, or the mechanics that we see around this, in many cases, they're just credential hunters, right? These are people that'll, just even get one compromised machine, or somehow exfiltrate a single password, not necessarily, run a whole campaign. And this can be a completely separate event. But then when a ransomware threat actor buys on the dark web a set of credentials and starts a campaign on an organization, that's where the attack advances, where lateral movement happens, and then ransomware hits. So a lot of times there's preparation for the attack, getting credentials to start the attack, and it can be really two separate attackers and two separate events. Now, the main problem with authentication is that malicious authentication and legitimate authentication looks just the same to Active Directory. A username and password is a username and password. If it's right, it works. So, you might be saying, all right, that's why we have MFA, right? So we have MFA to combat that, so to validate that a user is who he says he is. So MFA solves this part of the story, and we'll jump into that. But also there's non-human accounts that are a second part of the story, which also are a serious gap. So with MFA, the key gap is that even if you're able to implement it, I'll get to that in a sec. But so we have MFA and non-human accounts. So based on what we discussed until now, cyber insurers, brokers, anytime your school tries to get cyber insurance, the level of requirements from the cyber insurance brokers is really changed, right? Because 70% of their claims are around ransomware. So they really want to make sure you can combat this threat, because it's just the amount of payout that they're required to is too high. So they won't even insure companies that don't adhere to certain security standards. So this is a list that we comprised, with seeing a lot of different. It's like it's a mix of a lot of different insurers and brokers. It basically comes down to the same requirements, right? And you really need to have MFA for all critical resources, email, network, remote network access, and for all internal admin access, all interfaces need to be covered. So that's an important point. And also, you have to have some solution in place for privilege and service accounts, for inventory monitoring and protection. Now, the problem with any other, I call it legacy MFA or any kind of MFA you have in place, that when a user account gets compromised and tries to access Active Directory with command line access or any kind of interface that isn't, the front door, it's just let in, right? There's really no MFA available for all the various interfaces that attackers like using. So there's no way in real time to remediate and comply to this and really stop attacks. And a lot of times, we talk to companies and they say, yeah, we have MFA. I mean, who doesn't have MFA these days? It's almost everyone has MFA. But the bigger picture is that having it on, let's say, RDP or a web interface or your SaaS, all your SaaS apps just isn't enough, because there's always the other ways around. And if you get around, again, the identity, and more identities get compromised, lateral movement is possible. And this is really the reality for most companies. And service accounts is another very hard thing to tackle, right? Because you don't have a lot of visibility on how they're being used. There's not a human behind the scenes doing anything every time. In many cases, these accounts have, extremely high privileges. They could be domain admins, right, that are doing some kind of recurring non-human activity. And it's extremely hard to roll out a PAM solution to cover all these accounts, which is, again, what in some cases insurers are requiring, that as a control. So very high exposure to compromise for your service accounts. And this is another area that you'll see in our demo, what our approach is to securing your service accounts. All right, let's jump over to the architecture. I can't see any questions, so team, let me know if there's anything I should stop. All right. So, when thinking of the problem of protecting resources, there's the approach that all the other, I'd say the legacy MFA vendors took, and it's really protect resource by resource, right? Create an integration for, logging into Windows and deploying an agent, and create an SDK that you can implement in all kinds of applications, and cover application by application. But what the Silverfort approach was, there's so many different kinds of resources and applications and servers and legacy systems, but they all use a handful of protocols, right? At the end of the day, they use either more Active Directory protocols like Kerberos, LDAP, LDAPS, and TLM, or cloud native protocols, which obviously work with Azure AD out of the box, like SAML, OpenID Connect, etc. Silverfort integrates with your identity provider versus the end resource. So every access request coming from a user to any resource, let's say to a server, passes through a central identity solution, let's say Active Directory. And Silverfort can configure that solution to forward authentication requests to Silverfort, and allows us to reach out to Azure Active Directory to approve an authentication coming from one of these on-premise resources. So you basically get broader coverage with Azure Active Directory for basically any directory we can work with. And a real neat thing about this approach and architecture is the end resources aren't where that Silverfort exists, right? The servers, the applications, the databases, they don't know that Silverfort is behind the scenes. They're talking to Active Directory. we're sitting behind the scenes and triggering that additional verification before we let Active Directory, let the user in if he's checked out. Okay, and this unique architecture allows us to integrate with any kind of system without really touching the end system, and you'll see some of those in the demo. Okay, all right, so I'll pause and hand it over to Jason for the demo.
Right, I'm a little slow, Ron, but appreciate it. So any questions for Ron? Just going to check the chat really quick while we get set up here. Any questions before we move on? All right, well, thanks, Ron. So we'll jump in here. Please, someone tell me if you can't see my screen, but you should be able to see my screen. Again, my name is Jason Schupp. I lead the sales engineers here for the North American team at Silverfort. And what I'm going to talk about today is a quick demonstration of our product, and then also show some live interaction with how we extend MFA to on-prem Active Directory from Azure, and talk about some of the other benefits that we get with Silverfort and Microsoft. So with that, let's start with our main dashboard. And it really tells a good story about our solution and what we're doing. And out of the box, so imagine this little circle in the middle as the Silverfort brains, as the processing engine, and all these dots you see traversing left to right are actual authentications that are traversing our Silverfort lab. And if you look here, if you see, we're collecting authentications from both Azure AD and from Active Directory and from ADFS. So out of the box, we really are a true unified identity platform, whereas we have visibility into all authentications regardless of where they're originating from. So with Silverfort, you get a one-stop shop on all authentication traffic, all the logging. You can create policy and rules around those authentications. So that's just the high-level dashboard that we have within the product. What I want to do is show how this works in real time. So just a little setup here. So this is a Windows system I'm already RDP'd into in our lab, and this is my actual iPhone that I have tethered to my system. So you can see what the MFA experience looks like. So what I'm going to do is start with simple RDP, right? So extending MFA to RDP is not trivial. It's something that's been done for many years now, but typically it requires an agent on both my desktop and the server that you're connecting to. So with Silverfort, and again, back to Ron's overview in the last slide that he showed you, we integrate at the directory level. So regardless of where the authentication is originating from, we're going to be able to protect that authentication traffic and that identity. So what I'm going to do is start with entering my credentials. Right? What's happening behind the scenes is this authentication is going to hit Active Directory, and the authentication is going to get forwarded to Silverfort. Silverfort's then going to make a decision, and we'll talk through this. So what you see here is I'm getting a prompt from Silverfort to sign in with Microsoft. Okay, so this is the normal Microsoft sign-in that you would expect to see when you're using Azure AD. Only now it's originating from an application that's starting the authentication behind Active Directory, which is not something you currently have today unless you are a current Silverfort customer. So I'm actually going to skip this for now. So I want to show you what it looks like with other applications as we authenticate. So because I did not finish the sign-in, this is not going to connect. And we'll come back to this in just a minute. But what I really want to show you is not just RDP and applications that you once may have previously had protected, but let's look at everything else, right? So here is a bunch of PowerShell scripts. Let me run one of these with PowerShell. And the significance of PowerShell and how it relates to the discussion around ransomware is that this is the #1 attack vector for the adversary. So if they get a foothold in your environment, they're likely going to use PowerShell to not only execute the malware or ransomware, but they're also going to use this to propagate and move laterally, right? So again, going from the single incident, the local incident, to catastrophic breach is really what we're looking at. So being able to protect PowerShell is key, and I'm going to show you what that looks like. So I'm going to enter PowerShell just like you normally would. And Murphy's Law, live demo, this won't work, right? Reset this. You go back to RDP. I may have messed up by not finishing the authentication with Silverfort. So let me actually log off the system and log back in so that we, here we go. Now it's working. All right, so I'm just going to go ahead and finish the sign-in process here. So also notice that we have context around the authentication. And basically, this is me signing in to Microsoft. So I'm now signing in with Microsoft. And what we're doing is actually extending the conditional access policies from Microsoft Azure to on-premise Active Directory. And here I'm going to use my Authenticator app. And as you see, I'm getting a prompt on my phone. I'm going to click Approve. And then it's going to establish a connection through RDP. Authentication is successful. I close this window, and lo and behold, I'm now connected through the RDP session. So now that I'm signed in, so our Azure policies that are configured here have SSO enabled, so single sign-on, so to minimize the login piece. So now I'm going to go back to the PowerShell. So I'm already authenticated through Azure AD. I'm going to run this bridging. Run this with PowerShell again. And here you see we're being prompted again to sign in through Microsoft. This is Silverfort saying, hey, you need to broker the connection through Microsoft. So we're encapsulating this to SAML, translating it to Azure AD. I'm already signed in. And we'll see that the PowerShell execution has completed. So the significance of this, as I was saying earlier, is PowerShell is the #1 attack vector for propagating ransomware. And really malware, right? It's the lateral movement piece of the attack, and being able to MFA and provide the powerful controls that's offered from Microsoft Azure on-premise to Active Directory is something that we've not seen before. So very cool feature, very cool functionality. Is it's basically modernizing Active Directory with the current Azure AD controls. Okay, so I could go on, and I could show you. I could show you file shares. I could show you anything that really hits Active Directory. So anything that authenticates to AD can now be extended to Azure AD. So let's go back through the console and poke around a little bit, and I'll show you some other features and functionality that we have, along with the protection of service accounts and some of the insights that we produce along with Microsoft Defender for Identity. So we'll automatically build a list of applications. So as you see here, we see multiple authentication types. We see some already connected from AD. Here are some through Azure AD that we've already bridged. So bridging is a terminology that we use to extend Azure AD controls to on-premise Active Directory. Let's say whatever this app is, it's connected through Radius. If I want to apply modern controls to this authentication through Radius, all I got to do is click this button, add a user. This pulls directly from Active Directory users, groups, and OUs. Add a user, click Save, and suddenly now that application will be bridged to Azure AD. So we've just modernized an old legacy, application that's using Radius for authentication. Okay, and again, there's really no limitation to this. This is anything that connects through Active Directory. So on to service accounts. Service accounts are a little different. Obviously, there's no human generally behind the service account, or at least there shouldn't be. So part of our discovery and being able to see all authentications allows us to apply some logic and some AI and other controls to first identify those accounts that are functioning and acting or behaving like a service account. So two examples I can use is one, if you know where all your service accounts are, which most organizations do not, right? Or if you have a specific naming standard for your service accounts, we can plug all that information into Silverfort and we can automatically discover those accounts. Where we start to see the real power is looking at the AI and some of the other analytics that we provide on the authentications. So if I click and drill into this particular service account listed at the top here, what we see at the top right, and albeit this is going to be small on your screen, I'm sure, but these are all authentications by day, right? This is 8 roughly Kerberos authentications, spikes up to 10, very consistent, very indicative of machine-to-machine activity, right? Users are not this consistent. So this is the same authentication traffic over and over every single day. It's behavior of a service account. So not only do we see this behavior and we can then classify this as a service account and treat it as such, we also capture all source and all destination information about the authentications. So think of this as the dependencies. So look at this. If we click on 11 sources, so essentially this service account has run on these 11 sources and has contacted these 13 destinations. So now not only do we know about all our service accounts and where they live, we also have the dependencies and how they're being used. And then we can figure out and determine, hey, is this normal behavior? Should this service account or service accounts be used on these set of systems? We also pull in some very rich risk indicator information, as you can see here. This account has domain admin privileges, which most service accounts do. It's using an old password, coincidentally. Also something that plagues service accounts, and we're calling it a service account. And there's probably 40 different risk indicators that we're pulling in on just Silverfort side, but then also risk indicators that come from Microsoft Defender for Identity and even Microsoft Defender for Endpoint and other solutions to help enrich the insight information and the risk information that we're collecting. Okay, so now I know the service account, I have the destinations. What do we do with this information? We have created a capability that we refer to as virtual fencing. So we automatically build policy based on those sources and destinations, and then give you, the administrator, the control of the organization to control what's allowed and what's not allowed. So think of this as a true virtual fence where we can say, look, if it's not originating from these sources and going to these destinations, we can take one of 3 actions. 1, we can alert. 2, we can notify your SIM. Or 3, we can outright block access, hence the virtual fencing, right? So we're basically putting a fence and a protective barrier around these service accounts so that if and when they are compromised, right? Or if there are service accounts that have been existing in your environment for decades that you have no idea about and they're executed, we'll have some level of protection around those service accounts. So, you know, if the passwords are compromised, it's not such a big deal. Other risk indicators that you can see listed here, along with this repetitive behavior. Perhaps there's interactive logins, right? Another big no-no when it comes to using service accounts. We often see domain admins and other privileged user taking advantage of these service accounts to complete tasks. We'll pick up on that interactive logins. Again, being able to truly analyze the login information from various sources helps us build this information. Right, you can see that 60 of these accounts are also highly privileged and broadly used. Okay, so that's service account protection. Last thing I'm going to cover is insights, and this is going to be pretty short and sweet. But basically, again, with the visibility piece, having information about all the authentications, we also have a risk-based engine that runs and not only picks up hygiene information that's pulled from Active Directory. Right? When we combine this data, so we're not, again, even this data, we're not looking at on a silo as our own. We are looking at it together with Microsoft. So we're pulling in the Microsoft known information, the threat information from Microsoft for Defender or Defender for Identity, and bringing this information in to show, you know, not only inventory information, but also risky type behavior. Right? So here you can see ASREP roasting, some attacks against the Kerberos protocol, SMB enumeration, so on and so forth. And there's various things that we're collecting here. And then being able to give you insights into top risky users, resources, top connected users, so on and so forth. And then the ability to drill in and actually look at this information, right? So we can drill in and see, again, not just log information from Active Directory, but log information from all different types of authentication data. All right, so that's sort of it in a nutshell. Again, from the visibility piece, being able to extend the modern controls of Azure AD to on-premise Active Directory, protecting service accounts, and then that rich insight information, all coupled together with the power of Microsoft and Silverfort to bring together this solution. All right, so we'll pause again as we pass back to Ron, and certainly welcome any questions you want to throw in the chat window. That'll be helpful.
Thanks a lot, Jason.
Yes, sir. Quiet group today. I guess we're doing a really good job at explaining. There's no questions.
Hey, this is I was giving everybody a chance. This is Jonathan. I just had a clarifying question, I guess, around what you were talking about when you mentioned the architecture, and then kind of drilled into the use case, right? You mentioned the bridging of the applications. So again, just kind of a clarifying question. So as long as any application, right, I can bridge it to Azure AD, and then the use of that application is now going to be prompted for an additional authentication step. Is that right? Am I understanding that right?
Yeah.
Yep.
So once we bridge the application into Azure AD, you can do whatever and anything you'd like you would do with any cloud application. So any kind of conditional access policy, risk-based, time-based, you get everything the way you're used to using conditional access. It just applies to more applications.
Got it. Makes sense. Yeah, it was super cool seeing that with PowerShell, right? Because that's definitely something I'm used to using a lot. So definitely cool to see that that additional step when running scripts. So, thanks for the clarification.
Thank you. All right, so just a few more items, and one thing is really important for us to mention that we work with really well with all the stack, whether if you're using E5 or A5 or even A3, integrating into various parts of Azure Active Directory, right? A conditional access, like we discussed, but also leveraging all of your existing capabilities that you have in Azure AD, like passwordless, or if you're leveraging PIM for some privileged workflows, we can extend that to any application that's running on premise. And on the other side of things, using Microsoft Defender or any product in the Defender suite, like Defender for endpoints or for cloud or for identity or for Office, and we work with all of that suite. And basically what we do is we can leverage a signal or a risk or an alert that was detected in Defender and be a call for action or a remediation for that alert. And once you mark a certain user has been compromised and manually or in an automated way, we can kick in and trigger additional authentication for that user to make sure that he can't get in without verifying himself ad hoc based on a certain alert. Okay, and we do offer special pricing for E5 customers, for A5 or E5 customers, yes. And just to sum it up, we really help you get where you need to be for cyber insurance with all that regards with privilege accounts and multi-factor authentication. So Silverfort and Microsoft together, we really cover all angles here and allow you to check them off, and also even produce a report that you can hand out to your insurer and that shows how you comply with these regulations. And it collects evidence from how you use our system to show that you comply. We'd love to get in touch. You can buy us through the Azure Marketplace, which makes things easier. And there's a lot of collateral on how we work together. This was all actually also attached in the invite or in the landing page to this webinar. So definitely feel free to check it out, read more, and most importantly, reach out to any of us for any additional questions, and we love to share more and help. So any questions on the chat?
Not seeing anything in the chat, Ron, but I'll jump in here with another question, if that's all right. So I was just kind of thinking through the architecture, right? And it looks like Silverfort, and please correct me if I'm wrong, it looks like it sits between your Active Directory and Azure Active Directory, right? So from a deployment and configuration standpoint, are there connections? Like, how do you set up the connections between those two so it sits in the middle, if that makes sense?
Yeah. So we leverage various APIs in Azure Active Directory, and we basically bridge applications into Azure Active Directory. So that includes registering them. So we leverage a lot of APIs to automatically register a new application for you. Let's say, something to represent a remote PowerShell. There is no real application, but we kind of mirror that into Azure Active Directory. So use a set of APIs for that, and it's all we have our administrative console, and it all communicates to Azure AD, and mostly leveraging the Graph API and other APIs to do all we do. And also when a client communicates to Azure Active Directory, then that's direct, right? So you get that pop-up sign with Azure AD, you click sign in Azure AD, and then we kind of redirect you to a web interface, which is just like you sign into Teams or to or Office or any other thing that's connected natively to Azure AD.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. And then I guess a follow-up for that would be if I'm interested in deploying Silverfort into my environment, right? What do you have, like a typical deployment timeline? Does it take a week, a month, a couple of days? What does that look like?
So I'd say, again, depending on the size of the environment, like the pure time you spend with Silverfort is usually hours, because the advantage of our architecture is that we only integrate with your identity provider. So with Active Directory, and if you still have ADFS around, we integrate with that, but that's it. We don't touch anything else. So once you have everything set up, it's really a matter of a short time, and you do need to make sure that networking is available, etc., and all the regular things, but all the prerequisites. But once you got those out of the way, it's the value is instant, and it scales, right? So if you choose to protect a group of resources to start off with a click of a button, you can add more in, and that's really effortless.
Yeah, I'm just going to double down on that because it is my team who leads the evaluations here at Silverfort. And it truly is hours, right? So once the prerequisites, we have documentation of prerequisites. Once they're done and we actually start the POC or start the deployment, it's literally hours we're up and running and showing value. So it's very cool.
Yeah, excellent. Very cool. Yeah, and then like you said, Ron, right? If you're doing a POC and you start with maybe a couple of applications, right? It seems super easy, right, to add additional ones. So yeah, that's excellent. Well, that's it for me. I could probably ask some more questions, but I'll kind of open it up to the rest of the crowd and see if anybody else has questions for Ron and the team. Okay, no problem at all. Just like Ron was saying, if you do think of additional questions, right, or if you're interested in moving forward, right, you can reach out to myself, to anyone on the Silverfort team, and we can get you directed to the right people. So yeah, thank you again, Jason, Ron. Excellent presentation. Really appreciate your time today. Great work, and we'll be talking to you soon, right? So.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.